So you heard about her early on when the chairperson alluded to her being our guest speaker for this evening. I've known her for 2 seconds. So she was born, she grew up, and tonight she is here. She has published widely, she's received many awards, and apparently hot off Google. Together with her husband Salim, they've just received the 4th Hideo Noguchi Africa Prize in Medical Research category from Japan for their work on HIV/AIDS and COVID-19 in Africa. Ladies and gents, your hands and mine for the one, the only, Professor Abdul Karim.
Dr. Arons, thank you very much for that very warm and entertaining introduction. So I'm glad you took care of the entertainment because my job is to talk about science. So honorable and distinguished guests, friends and colleagues, it's a real honor and pleasure to be here this evening to address you on basic science for sustainable development. And I'm going to, not surprisingly, focus on HIV, TB, and COVID-19. But before I go any further, I want to congratulate all the awardees this evening. This is a very special evening to celebrate science. And I think COVID-19 has reminded us how important science is for society. And while we may not always appreciate it, I think we've set new bars. Now in this presentation, I'm going to give you a quick overview on the HIV and TB epidemics globally to give you a bit of context. And then I want to focus on the priorities for sub-Saharan Africa, including South Africa. Then I'm going to talk about some of the issues relating to the social challenges facing young women in this continent. And then, if I have time, I'm going to talk about COVID-19 and then make some concluding remarks. And I have to say, when I say we, in describing the research, I'm going to describe the work that Slim and I initiated in 1989. And in that time, we've made many friends, many collaborators, and have grown the team to over 300. And the we also includes the CAPRISA consortium that was established in 2002 that includes 5 institutions: the University of Cape Town, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the University of Witwatersrand through the NICD, the University of Western Cape, and Columbia University in New York. So without further ado, let's get into the epidemic. And at a glance, in 2021 worldwide, there were 38.4 million people living with HIV, 650,000 HIV-related deaths, and 1.5 million new infections. So if in the past 2 years, you thought we were done and dusted with HIV and TB, this is a very stark reminder that we are seeing just over 4,000 new infections each day. Africa is home to about 70% of those infections, and South Africa, that has less than 1% of the global population, is home to 1 in 5 infections. Young women across Africa account for 1 in 4 new infections. Now, we've made great progress on increasing HIV treatment following the 2016 UN resolution of ending AIDS as a public health threat. A lot of our work has focused on the 1990 strategy, where 90% of people who live with HIV know their status, 90% of those are linked to care, and 90% of those in care and initiated on an antiretroviral treatment are virally suppressed. But you can see from this that we still have 1/3 of the people living with HIV not yet on treatment, and we cannot treat our way out of this epidemic. And the prevention targets are a reminder that the 2020 target, intermediate to the 2030 goal, was 500,000 infections, and we had 1.7 million in 2019 and about 1.5 million in 2020. So we're 3 times off our prevention target. And unless we get on top of prevention, we cannot let treatment alone get us there. I'm going to shift a bit to TB. And 8 countries across the globe account for 2/3 of the global TB burden. But what's important to underscore and appreciate is 8% of all of our incident TB cases occurred in people living with HIV. In fact, TB remains the most common opportunistic infection linked with advancing HIV disease. In an era where we have antiretroviral treatment available for anyone who tests positive, this is quite an unacceptable situation that people get so sick, they don't know their status, and they're dying. In sub-Saharan Africa, co-infection is the highest, co-infection with HIV and TB, and it exceeds 50%. In some settings, it's closer to 70%. 60% of the TB notified in the TB register is from HIV-TB co-infection. So TB and HIV are the main causes of death and life years lost in South Africa and in fact in many parts of Africa. And WHO estimates here in terms of premature mortality from 2013 shows that the more recent data in terms of causes of years of life lost for South Africa is not too different in 2017. So now I hope that background and context give you an understanding about these 2 priorities that I will focus on, which is the high HIV incidence in young women between the ages of 15 to 24 years and the high death rates from HIV-TB co-infection. So in 1990, Slim and I, having just done our master's at Columbia University, when I looked at the P-rated scientists, I was thinking we were at 28 at the time. We did one of the first population-based surveys. And what we described that was published in AIDS was this age-sex difference in HIV infection. Not only did women have 4 times more infection than men way back in 1990 when we were dealing with the silent spread of HIV, but women acquired HIV 5 to 7 years before young men did. We see the later rise of infection in men around age 25, and this pattern of age-sex disparity on when women get infected compared to men is reflected in the map of Africa that's more recent and continues to show this age-sex difference that's largest in the countries where the highest burden of HIV, about 60%, continues, which is Eastern and Southern Africa. Now, when this data was published, it wasn't without critics and differing results. But it was much later, around 2015, 2016, when the omics technology started to emerge, that we were able to unravel this in an unequivocal manner and go beyond the epidemiological descriptions. And I want to start with this community-based HIV prevalence survey that was done in one of the highest burden districts in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, bearing in mind that there are about 11 of these districts across the 52 districts in South Africa. In a survey that included about 10,000 women, the overall prevalence was 36%, with 44% of women infected and 28% of men. But again, if you follow the red bars and the blue bars, the red bars being infection in women, blue infection in men, you see already by age 18, 1 in 10 women infected with HIV, compared to 6.2% in men. By age 21, that's 1 in 3. By age 25, it's almost every other woman. By age 31, it's 70%. And you see the rise in infection in men around age 25 and a rapid catch-up by around age 34. Now, this data in particular on age needs to be looked at in the context of the fact that the 65% of our population in Africa is under the age of 35. So what we regard as a demographic dividend is being decimated by HIV and TB even before we get off the ground, impacting women, Sustainable Development Goal 5, more so than any other of the other markers and indicators we have. The phylogenetics work, where we were able to sequence viruses from recently infected individuals, was able to show us that where are these young women getting infected from? So it's not just about sex per se, but it's about who you have sex with. And what we see is that women under 25 are acquiring infection from men who are over 25, who in turn are getting infected from women who are their peers, the 1 year difference, who are over 25. And if these men only had sex with women under 25 or women over 25, we would have seen a very different epidemic trajectory to one that we continue to see. But it's because about 40% of the men in this study have partnerships with women under 25 and over 25, that we see this constant cycle of transmission as young women enter 15 to 24 years. Before they can say anything, there we are, lots infected. And this is what's sustaining this epidemic, despite very high, very high background prevalence that I've just shown you. So this data was shared on Get on the Fast Track, which followed the UN Ending AIDS as a Public Health Threat declaration, and came back from the UN AIDS report to the SANAC strategic plan, our current one until we have the new one ready, and it's one of the priority actions there. Now, while we were monitoring this evolving HIV epidemic, and here looking at the blue curve, we started to notice in northern KwaZulu-Natal something happening with TB. And what was happening with TB was that it was shifted about 5 to 7 years, indicating this this idea that TB and HIV are intertwined. And in fact, this intertwining of HIV and TB has reversed many of the gains we started to make in the early 90s on TB. So when we first started as a global community to make decisions about ARV treatment availability, a lot of rationing needed to be done for a number of reasons. And so the severity of disease was one of the markers used as to who will be initiated on treatment earliest. And we used the crude marker of CD4 counts. But one of the challenges we knew, those who would benefit most from antiretroviral treatment, no surprise, is those that are co-infected with TB. But at that point, there weren't any other countries, particularly industrialized countries, that had been providing ARVs, or anyone that knew when do you initiate antiretroviral treatment in those co-infected with TB. And what we saw was a whole range of expert opinions. And when we initiated this trial, there were issues of if you start treatment simultaneously, there's the double drug burden, there's side effects, and if you don't do this early enough, you also have to deal with death. So there was equipoise in terms of answering this question. So when we did this trial, we actually found a 56% lower mortality rate with integration of TB and HIV treatment. And since its implementation, and I wouldn't say it's 100% attributable to this trial, we've seen a 52% reduction in annual TB deaths since the SAPIT results. The SAPIT results contributed to WHO guidelines, and in fact, most clinical guidelines across the world includes this evidence in terms of how one treats people with HIV and TB. So moving on to young women. So by now you have a very clear idea of the challenge of infection in young women. But what did we have in the early 90s? Well, we had abstinence, behavior change, male-female condoms, condoms coming a little bit later, and then in 2009, medical male circumcision. So you have to ask yourself, which of these are prevention tools for young women in Africa, particularly young women who would need to negotiate all of those options with their male partners who are at least 5 or 7 years older than them. And this was very well captured in the late Zena Stein's commentary in the American Journal of Public Health, making a global call for women-initiated technologies. And we and others joined, we call ourselves the Zena Warriors, the quest to find women-initiated technologies. And what did we have? Not too different from COVID. Look at what's on the shelf and try and repurpose that. And what did we find? Well, 11 years of failure after failure. In providing antiretroviral treatment, we came across tenofovir, a very safe and effective therapeutic agent, and decided to change from using these repurposed, non-specific drugs to something much more specific. And we conceptualized the CAPRISA 004 trial, largely inspired by the women from communities who didn't want something to use every day, and the PMT-CT interventions, and a whole lot of other evidence, and came up with the results that were announced in 2010 and published in Science, that tenofovir gel prevents HIV in women, 39% efficacy overall, 74% with high drug levels. So subsequently, there were several other trials that demonstrated oral use of tenofovir with emtricitabine as pre-exposure prophylaxis. The data is very consistent in men, very inconsistent in women if you're not in discordant relationships. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But in 2015, this then became a recommendation by the WHO and is part of standard of prevention. It's being implemented in many countries. Uptake varies. And I just want to give you a bit of a timeline there on this long road for HIV prevention technology from 1990 all the way to 2010. And I'm sorry to say that the story is not over. So these drugs that are anti-HIV specific or HIV specific have to be used to be effective. And what we see is when they are used, they are very effective. But what we also learned by measuring drug levels, because we had a positive test result, is that the threshold of drugs needed for women was substantially higher than that needed for men. And so we built on some early observations from the work of Joanne Mentel and Lindy Masson at UCT, where they found, using stored specimens from an acute infection study that I'll give you a little bit more insights on, that women who had genital inflammation as measured by a series of cytokines and a particular mix of these cytokines, 5 of 9, the sort of combination of these drugs, had an odds 3.2-fold higher of acquiring HIV infection. And what we found in looking at the microbiome of women who got infected in the CAPRISA 004 trial is that women with lactobacilli dominance had an efficacy of 61%, whereas those who had less than 50% had an efficacy of 18%. So how this links with drug levels is that the pro-drug is delivered needs 2 phosphorylation steps. So in thinking about what's competing for the phosphates, we had to look at these organisms in the genital tract and found indeed where you had this dysbiosis, you were seeing less efficacy. So not only is the genital inflammation, vaginal dysbiosis, enhancing HIV acquisition in women, it's also reducing the potency of tenofovir gel. So we have some clues now, including HPV and how it mobilizes activated CD4 cells to the point of exposure, enhances HIV acquisition. But I'm going to move on a little bit to say, well, what we know is that it's important to reduce HIV infection in adolescent girls and young women. The root cause of their vulnerability is gender power disparities, and this technologies that we're all working on is the first step to addressing a social challenge. Partnerships with communities are key, and products need to reach those most in need for scientific discoveries to realize their full potential. Age-disparate sexual partnering is a key factor driving high rates, and genital inflammation is a major biological risk factor, and that we need to continue our efforts to increase access to oral PrEP, but we also need to focus on some provider-initiated technologies that are less user-dependent. So when I mentioned the genital inflammation work, I said I'll return to acute infection and the importance of having well-characterized cohorts with specimens collected over time so that these repositories can be tapped into. And here you see, and I'm glad I just spotted Lynn in the audience and Koleka as well, because they've been using this cohort, a cohort that was established in 2004 with about 256 women who have an over 90% retention rate. And it has created opportunities for masters and doctoral graduates at UCT, at WITS, at UKZN, and has enabled a whole new cadre of science leadership to emerge. And I think you saw several of them during COVID. Some of you may remember Penny Moore on TV. You may see Tulio around. You may see also Janal and others. Time doesn't permit me to continue, but as you can see here, a whole range of things that has advanced our knowledge of clade C pathogenesis, critically important for vaccine and for therapeutic development. And you can see all these incremental advances that have been made. But I want to focus now on CAPRISA 012 and a new concept or strategy, if you like, passive immunization for HIV prevention. So what we discovered maybe about a decade ago is that the antibodies that are produced when you get infected is not equal and the same. And a few people produce these broadly neutralizing antibodies. Just over 30 of them have been described across the globe. So as these papers started to emerge, Lynn and Penny had this idea. Let's go into the repository and see if any of our CAP256 women who got infected developed these, and lo and behold, they found a couple. But the one that really was stunning, our real rock star, was, I'll use her number, her study number, which is 256, a 27-year-old volunteer who was enrolled in a pre-AI, the pre-CAPRISA 04 trial, who got infected on around mid-year 2005, was initiated on ARTs in 2009, doing fantastically well on antiretroviral treatment. But what the NICT team did was that after discovering this antibody in 2013, they worked very closely with the National Institutes of Health from the US Vaccine Research Center to find that B cell, which is like a needle in the haystack that makes these antibodies, and use that antibody immortalized it. Even, you know, it was like a Mercedes-Benz. They made it like a Rolls-Royce, so I don't know what's the best speedster around now, but it's really souped up, and we've made enough quantities of this antibody for animal and human studies. And this is the results from the animal studies. All of the animals that were challenged with the monkey equivalent SHIV had full protection. So we've now moved on and we've done first-in-human studies. And I'm sharing all of this because when we start with basic science and we want to invest in frontier research and take it all the way through, there are many, many challenges along the way. And here we've been able to do something that people said we can't or shouldn't do in Africa, which is first-in-human studies. We've done the 1-2 safety and PK trials of mAb combinations. And based on the AMP trial results, another passive immunity study, we've decided this new approach, which is to combine two VNABs, one from the US, VRC07 523LS, with CAPRISA 256 V2LS, where this will give us coverage across 90% of the circulating clades, and at least one of them will hit a susceptible target there. And these are selected both for potency and breadth. And what we're doing right now is evaluating subcutaneous doses at 4 and 6 month intervals so we can assess whether that 2-month interval in terms of final dosing will help. And it's designed to give us a safety signal and a safety and a signal of efficacy as a pathway to a larger efficacy trial. Again, a very, very long story from where we start to where we're going. But it's also a partnership across 3 continents, with each partner having clear responsibilities and goals. And we've also started something that we've learned when we participate in multi-center trials. There's no guarantee we'll have access when those results come out. And so we are working with Evotech to start looking at scaling up manufacturing and establishing those plants. And I think what's really important about this is that it's about a prevention method from Africa, from one of our participants, a gift, if you like, developed and tested in Africa to solve one of Africa's biggest HIV problems. And there's a bonus here. If this works, we actually have a much clearer roadmap for HIV vaccine development. With HIV vaccines, we face many, many challenges. And it's very different from COVID, and I don't have time to go into it. As I said, I speak on behalf of over 200 scientists and students working on all of these projects. I've listed some of the names, but we also have donors, diverse donors within South Africa, outside South Africa, from Europe, from the US, and many, many collaborations that have been developed over the years. And I don't think time allows me to talk about COVID, but just to say that with COVID, you know, as we sit here today, all of us having been isolated for 2 years, we've come a long way. And I think COVID has set a new bar in terms of knowledge generation. Unprecedented, 6 vaccines in less than a year. And what we've learned, you know, in the time of fear, anxiety, uncertainty, where our knowledge was incomplete, we did do the very basics of wearing masks, social distancing, hand sanitizing, isolating, etc. And then we had the vaccines. Vaccines brought us hope. But very shortly after that, we saw variants of concern that are able to evade vaccine immunity as well as naturally acquired immunity. So it's really changed the end game totally. What we're learning now as we enter the next era is that mildly symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals who get infected with COVID can develop, about half of them, long COVID. And I don't have time to go into the data, but I'm telling you, some of us in the room may have had COVID and we know what long COVID looks like. That's the next tsunami we need to prepare for, because it comes with many, many different sequelae. We don't understand it totally, we don't understand it fully, and we cannot afford to wait and see, but we need to be more proactive, both in moving beyond just responding to sublineages or new variants, but getting ahead of the coronaviruses for us to build stronger and live more positively in this era of many, many pandemics. So I think you get a sense that there's a long time to do these things. In conclusion, I hope you appreciate that excellent and impactful science is alive and well in South Africa across many institutions. But that game-changing science is a long and slow process with many challenges and failures that are built on a strong foundation of locally nuanced knowledge of the problem and its evolution. In the introductory video, there was a point made about foundation, and EPI is the foundation, followed by good pathogenesis, good cohort studies, and good repositories. And then we need long-term investments in science infrastructure training and capacity development. We need multidisciplinary teams and synergy between institutions nationally and internationally. We are too small a country to each of our institutions try to be experts. And in an era of increasing incomplete epidemics and pandemics, resilience and rapid ability to pivot to address new challenges is critical. We don't need to relearn that. We've just spent 2 years learning that. But I want to close with a key lesson from HIV for COVID, and that's the importance of mutual interdependence and shared responsibility. Global solidarity is essential, and this is not the time to monetize knowledge. It's essential to access life-saving medication equally across the board. Countries where individuals see caring for fellow citizens as important do much better than those where individuals focus on themselves first. And we have the good tradition of Ubuntu that really guides us in this togetherness and shared responsibility. And at the end of the day, when we have pandemics or epidemics, no one is safe until everyone is, in the words of Tedros from WHO. Thank you very much.